Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Bryan Hyde.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Society and the State. Bryan Hyde here along with Connor Boyack. And Connor, I take it as a little bit of a compliment. Some people noticed that we've been notoriously missing.
Where did you go?
In the last few weeks. And truth be told, we started doing this podcast back in July of 2017, and we have been, I'll just pat us on the back here, try not to break my arm doing it. We've been pretty consistent in getting a couple of episodes a week out, but the last month or so, we have been a little more hit and miss. Mm-hmm. And so we felt like maybe we owe our listeners an explanation of what we've been up to. And, if this sounds like we're justifying ourselves, it's because we are, but hopefully you'll buy it.
Yeah, podcasting is not our full-time job by any means. Let's start, Bryan, with you. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners know or knew at one point that you used to work here at Libertas Institute, which I lead here in Utah, and that's my full-time gig. But fewer people probably know that you departed several months back and are now doing something else. So what are you up to?
I am building a nationwide media platform called the Loving Liberty Radio Network. And we have hosts from all across the country. Our focus is promoting and preserving and defending the principles of private property, free markets, individual liberty, and religious freedom. And so it's, I guess I could just sum it up and say, essentially, I'm creating a dream job that I have dreamed about for many, many years.
And fits nicely with your background being in radio, right? This seems to be very consistent with that, except now you're kind of building out a much larger network. Would that be fair to say?
That is fair to say. And I'll sing the praises of technology. You and I have talked a lot about disruptive technology and just some of the advantages we have today that weren't always there for those who have a particular cause to move. But you can put together your own network. And it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of technical stuff that goes in there, not all of which I understand. But I'm here to tell you it's for real. This can happen.
And so where are you guys at in the process? Obviously, with you and I going dark for a little while, you guys are working hard on something. What specifically are you up to?
So we are in the process of launching this network as a free app that anybody with a smartphone can enjoy. So it's made for Android. It's made for iPhone. You can get it on Google Play. You can get it on iTunes. And it's a completely free app, streaming live audio 24/7, but also with access to archives because maybe there's a particular topic you want to go back and revisit. So we podcast those topics, and from there we're just, to borrow a phrase, building our tribe and hopefully spreading the message that so many others are working to spread, and that is the message of liberty.
And from my perspective, this kind of came on the tail of the whole Bundy issue and your involvement there. How did your coverage of that, your involvement with that, kind of lead into what you're doing now, if at all?
It's, some people will say serendipity. I kind of like the term divine providence, but there were just a number of puzzle pieces that kind of fell into place, seemingly by coincidence, but to me it makes perfect sense that this had a feeling like it was meant to be. I was asked to help provide some social media coverage for the Bundy family during their trial down in Las Vegas. As a result of that, we discovered that there's a very real thirst out there for immediate and credible news or information that isn't strained through a corporate media filter. And I know I'm kind of throwing all of the corporate media under the same bus here, but there's a real dearth of trust in the media today, and I think some of that is extremely well justified. I don't think that I've ever seen such an abandonment of impartiality as what I saw 2 years ago during the election cycle, when it couldn't have been more clear who the media was for and who they were against.
It reminds me, just as a brief tangent, just this morning when we're recording this, I saw a news article about Elizabeth Warren revealing finally the details of her ancestry, where she's been making claims and leveraging the fact that she's Native American. And as she now finally publicly discloses her actual ancestry, she's maybe 1% Native American, and yet the media coverage does not hit her on that at all. It is very favorable, simply saying she released the details, and then buried like 8 paragraphs down is the fact that, maybe 6 to 10 generations ago I had one person in my lineage who might have been of a Native American descent, whereas had a Republican or a conservative, even Donald Trump especially, made that claim on the campaign trail, the media would be hitting him like crazy now. So that the imbalance is just profound, and recognizing that I think is important, because you get sucked into it and you just get bombarded with these headlines, and you don't realize how biased, how manipulated it all really is.
And just to be clear, we're not going to make any claims that the hosts on the Loving Liberty radio network are magically unbiased or are perfectly objective in everything they say. But we will admit what our bias is and where we're coming from, and explicitly will challenge our listeners and those who follow us to think things through for themselves and to exercise their own franchise to arrive at what does it mean. We just won't try to take the liberty of telling them this is what you're supposed to think. We'll invite them to think and hopefully elevate the discussion to a little bit higher level than bumper sticker slogans being shouted back and forth at one another.
And what's the higher purpose? What's the goal of Loving Liberty in doing all this? Would it just be educating people so that in their personal and professional lives they kind of have that foundation of these freedom principles, or what's kind of the goal that you guys are after?
The overall goal that we have is to persuade people and to impact hearts and minds, primarily to promote a free, virtuous society that is known for its individual liberty and that is sustained by correct principles. And that's a long way of getting around. We want people to take this more seriously because, like a lot of people, we feel that there's a great danger that a lot of people have forgotten what got us to the point where we are today. How did we get to be such a blessed country, or to have a society that has so many advantages that we have traditionally enjoyed? We'd like to see those things remain.
Excellent. Well, that sounds fun. So I think our listeners, what's the website? I mean, can we add that to the show notes page? Where can they find the app once it's up and running? What would that look like?
Actually, they can go to their app store, either for Apple or for Google Play, and it's just Loving Liberty, and it's free of charge. Anyway, it's something we hope that you'll enjoy. Let's talk about what you've been up to. You've been a busy bee yourself, and I'm saying that pun intended because I know that you're an apiary. But what's been keeping Connor running these last few weeks?
So I think we've mentioned in past shows that we've been working on the medical cannabis issue for a few years here in Utah. Most recently, we had a ballot initiative that was set up, and we got sufficient signatures, so it's on the ballot for this year's election. And that's a wonderful thing after years of legislative inaction and indifference, to be able to just take it straight to the people. As we said on another episode, I'm at the point where I am less dogmatic on, ballot initiatives or democracy are a bad thing, when from my perspective, representative democracy is often subject to the same problems and poor outcomes. Nonetheless, we have this ballot initiative. And as a result, we've been getting beat up for months especially, but for quite a while, from our opponents who are misrepresenting what that ballot initiative is. They've been outright lying and deceiving people into thinking that it's for strictly recreational marijuana, which, of course, in a conservative state like Utah does not poll well. They've been saying that medical marijuana is already legal, which is a farce, because really only, a synthetic THC derivative is available to be prescribed for nausea, which often doesn't work well. Or more recently, a CBD product has been FDA approved. It's not finalized and rescheduled yet, but that's going to be available for people with epilepsy. But there's tons of other conditions, and thousands in Utah, tens of thousands of other people who are not helped by those very narrow FDA-approved products, which a whole plant medical cannabis can strongly benefit them. So we did the ballot initiative. And even though our opponents are trying to deceive people into voting against it, it's still polling well, 64%. But to your question, Brian, why so busy? Well, about a month and a half ago, we decided to enter into discussions with the opposition. We were actually invited by the Speaker of the House here in Utah, and we sat across from one another and had a conversation just to see if it was even worth having another conversation. And we were light years apart, and we had been beating one another up in the press, and so of course there was a lot of distrust and animosity and so forth. But we had another conversation, and then another one, and we had some discussions as to why we were supportive or why they were opposed, and what they really believed with this argument they were claiming, and so forth. And that eventually led into discussions about the policy itself, talking specifics. And what we identified was an opportunity to take this ballot initiative that we had worked on and make some amendments to it, make some tweaks that would resolve the opposition's concerns about it being a slippery slope to recreational or youth access and so forth. Basically, put some additional guardrails around the ballot initiative. And in so doing, neutralize their opposition and be able to move forward with a robust, broad medical cannabis program. Specifically, how that's going to work is that we can't change this ballot initiative. We can't take it off, and so it's still going to get voted on. But then a couple weeks later, the governor is going to call our legislature into a special session, whether our ballot initiative wins or loses. I mean, it'll win, but regardless of the outcome, we'll be called into a special session. And then the legislature will enact this new agreement that's basically the ballot initiative with some minor modifications to resolve concerns. And let's be clear, I mean, we've been David versus Goliath because the governor doesn't like our ballot initiative, House leadership doesn't like it, Senate leadership hates it, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the Mormon Church here in Utah, significant influential stakeholder, they opposed it. The Medical Association, law enforcement, basically the entire establishment was arrayed against our initiative, and nonetheless we've been polling positively. But my worry, Brian, and the reason why I've been doing this polling about 70 or 80-hour weeks working on the specific text and changes and all these debates and dialogues for the past month or so is because I don't want to win the battle, and by that I mean pass Proposition 2 and yay, we win, only to lose the war, right? Because in fact, in our state, and this is common in other states with ballot initiatives, in Utah, in 2000, the voters passed a ballot initiative for civil asset forfeiture to restrict it. It was a good initiative. And then immediately thereafter, police and prosecutors began lobbying the legislature successfully to undermine and loosen some of the restrictions in that law. So there's precedent for this to happen.
It would have been under attack the moment it passed.
Absolutely. They would have gutted it. So I said, well, rather than them gutting it and us being on the sidelines because they hate the fact that we kind of forced this down their throats, let's preemptively enter into these conversations, find a way, rather than with a sledgehammer, let's use a scalpel to kind of narrowly address their concerns while protecting the rest of it. And that's what we did. We ended up with 90% of what we wanted rather than 30 or 40% had we just crammed this down their throats and then they in retaliatory fashion, pushed back. And so it's been really interesting seeing kind of the results of that, Brian. In the past couple of weeks since we did this press conference, we announced that we'd had this agreement that regardless of the outcome, we will do this special session and this new amended bill shortly thereafter. And it's interesting because, there certainly are a lot of people who are upset that we even did this and why did you negotiate? But then you have all these other people. In fact, just the other night I had someone approach me at an event say, I'm just blown away that this is even possible. How is it that people so bitterly opposed to one another could find agreement?
And that's, to me, that as just a very interested bystander sitting back and watching this, that is the miracle of what happened here. And I'm not a guy who likes compromise. I've often said, look, if we want to compromise, we compromise on where we're going to go for lunch. But there are some places where I just draw the line. But in this case, I think you're absolutely right. It would have been picked apart. And the fact that you got the opposition to the table, and even more importantly, you got them to recognize and to concede that, you know what, there's a legitimate injustice that's taking place for sick people being treated like criminals. And based on that, and them being willing to make that concession, the two sides were able to come together and find a solution. Nobody got exactly what they wanted, but that's probably a good indication that then that was probably an effective compromise.
Well, and I've never liked this bill that we've worked on. I mean, it's never been a libertarian bill. It's been a libertarian-ish, bill. Because when we first got started with our Senator Mark Manson, who championed this effort for 2 years, that bill was itself a compromise, right? We were trying to find a way to, in a maximum way possible, legalize medical cannabis, but with significant restrictions and regulations to appease all the other legislators we knew that we had, whose votes we had to get. So out of the gate, it was itself a compromise, just trying to find what's that balance point where we can kind of reduce or eliminate enough opposition to allow maximum freedom to move forward. And so you'd introduce the bill and you'd narrow it and you'd narrow it and you'd narrow it and, this concession and that compromise, trying to find what's that final balance point. And then when that was unsuccessful and we did Proposition 2, again, we said, okay, what are the things we can kind of modify or change in here now that we're going to have to appeal to all voters that are going to kind of eliminate those concerns enough that we can get this passed. And then now we're doing the same thing. We had another conversation, a much more direct and engaged conversation. Say, okay, let's identify your very specific concerns and then do what we need to address those concerns, eliminate your opposition, and then allow the program to move forward. So, yeah, I mean, it is a compromise. It is the most freedom that we can get for these patients within the environment that we're in. But, I mean, in another world, my bill for medical marijuana would not be dozens of pages of new text and regulations. It would be simply a repeal of the criminal prohibition on a plant, right? Like, let free people do what they want and only, enforce the law upon them if they're, driving while under the influence or selling it to a kid or, whatever. It would be a very simple law to write. But I do think there's a lesson to be learned here where diplomacy has its place. And to be fair, Brian, I mean, you say like, how did we come together and whatever. This never would have happened had we not done the ballot initiative, right? I mean, we tried having dialogue during the legislative process with some of these opponents. They just wanted to kill it. They wanted it to go away. And we had no leverage. We were basically going around begging for our freedom. Mother, may I please have a little bit of medical cannabis for these patients. And so we had no strength. We had no negotiating leverage. Only when we did the ballot initiative and when we got certified, we had sufficient signatures. When our opponents saw that they now had to deal with us, when we forced the issue upon them, then they were willing to talk to us.
They saw the writing on the wall.
Right.
They knew it was going to pass and not by a razor margin.
Yeah, so let's be very clear that we didn't somehow convince them to talk to us and negotiate. No. They were kind of backed into a corner and finally recognized. And so I think, there is a place then for using these tactics in order to get what you want or more of what you want, because absent that ballot initiative, absent the process by which we could just thrust our opponents into negotiations, they wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't be where we are. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there about strategy in diplomacy.
I think there's a lesson that goes along with the other lessons you're pointing out here, and that is you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I've been guilty of this, when it comes to my freedom, all or nothing. I've felt that way for many times. But the reality is, if it's going to be all or nothing, then you're probably going to end up with nothing. So you've got to be flexible enough to gain the strategic high ground where you can and work towards that goal from there, rather than just, I'm planting the flag and this is the hill I'll die on, because there's a good chance you may just actually die on that hill.
Exactly. In fact, I've spoken with patients who have taken that exact position. They don't like the fact that we've spoken with, quote, the enemy. They, after years of legislative indifference, just want to cram Prop 2, the ballot initiative, down everybody's throats. They want to teach them a lesson. And I had one in particular outright say, no, this is the hill I want to die on. It's Proposition 2 or nothing. And I said, I can't support that, because I have so many patients depending on us to get the maximum amount we can. And just to kind of score a victory in November, come what may, only to have everything gutted soon thereafter. I'm not going to go to those patients and say, oh, but we stood on a hill, we planted a flag, and yeah, we got decimated, but we made it to the top of that hill once upon a time. Like, sorry, that's a Pyrrhic victory. Like, you don't want to actually win. To me, there's no benefit to winning a battle and then losing the war. I want to win the war, or rather minimize enough carnage in the war that I can preserve as many lives as possible and have some semblance of victory in the end. And I see that as what we're doing here, that we're not going to get everything we wanted. But incrementalism has its place. As much as I'm with you, Brian, and I want to plant that flag and I want to be absolutist, I'll give a very specific example. When we started these discussions, some of the people involved were so skeptical that anything beneficial would come out of these discussions from our part. They perceived us to be dogmatic, stubborn, flag-planting absolutists, right? Our way or the highway. And we now learned later in the dialogue, as we've kind of developed somewhat of a working relationship, they've been very open in saying, yeah, we didn't think you would, quote, compromise it all, that you would negotiate. But the fact that we were willing to make some concessions, that we were willing to kind of find what that balance point is between maximum freedom and minimizing the opposition or resolving their concerns, encouraged them to continue talking to us. And so we found that point. And now we can get a program enacted that isn't everything we want, but is substantially more than the alternative where we cram it down their throats, they push back, they have all the power at that point, the legislature, the governor, the LDS Church here in Utah, that they would be the establishment coming back against us, and then we would end up with very little. So absolutism, from my perspective on this issue, would have gotten us a momentary victory, but then we would have lost in the end, and I think that's bad strategy.
Okay, so I have one clarification that I want to get. There is going to be a special session called after the election, after the ballot initiative is voted on, and it appears that has the numbers to pass. You are encouraging people to go ahead and continue to vote for Proposition 2, even though the end result will probably be something slightly different. Why do you want people to vote for Proposition 2?
It's a good question. Like, if we've already kind of preemptively compromised, then what's the point of the vote? And in fact, our opponents they want in another world, the ballot initiative would go away. As I said, it's on the ballot, and we actually legally cannot take it off. There's no legal mechanism as its organizers to say, hey, just kidding, we've got this new agreement. So it's still on the ballot. And so being on the ballot, and being that our opponents don't like what is in Proposition 2 itself, they continue encouraging people, no, vote it down. We have this better way. We take the opposite approach. After years of legislative indifference and after years of positive polling showing overwhelming support on the part of the public for medical cannabis, we see the vote as, if nothing else, a symbolic message to send to the legislature to convey public support for medical cannabis, so that it's kind of a backstop or an insurance policy to those negotiations going forward and say, well, wait a minute, our starting point is not nothing, and then we're doing this new compromise. Our starting point is Proposition 2. It's this thing that the public wanted. We're willing to kind of come down here and make a few little compromises. But if you try taking it any further down, we have kind of that mandate from the masses, or the amorphous will of the people, right?
There we go.
We're going to use it, right? They've used it against us so many times, so you got to use it when it's on your side. But no, to me, it's an opportunity simply to send a message to the legislature that says we're tired, we're fed up with how you've handled this. Get this done, get it resolved. And that's going to be a message, I think, that will be felt for years to come. As we now do a civil forfeiture, in our case, as I mentioned, we can point back to that other ballot initiative and say, look, 69% of the public voted for that thing, and yet here's the legislature continuing to undermine it. That's a useful, talking point, persuasion point. I think the same will be true of this. And so I guess, for both of our part, Bryan and I, this is a fun project for us. We really enjoy talking to one another, bringing on interesting guests to talk to you. But from time to time, the ebb and flow of other work sets in. We've both been very busy, but now I think we're at a point where we're going to jump back in and pump out a lot more episodes. We look forward to those conversations. Bryan certainly has been very busy, myself as well. And we'll see you as the conversation continues here on Society and the State.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.